Empire of Blood, the conquest that lives inside you. In the spring of 1220, in a city that had once been one of the most beautiful in the world, a girl stood perfectly still while the world ended around her. Her name was Zarya. She was 14 years old. She had dark hair that her mother used to braid each morning before prayers. She had a laugh that her father said sounded like water over stones. She had a future, a promised marriage, a home she had already imagined, children she had already named in the quiet of her own thoughts. In the span of one morning, all of it was gone. The Mongol soldiers did not rage through the streets of her city the way conquerors in old stories did. They moved with something far more terrifying than rage. They moved with order, with precision, with the calm efficiency of men who had done this before and would do it again and had long since stopped thinking of it as anything other than work. A soldier looked at Zarya for exactly 3 seconds. He was not looking at her face. He was assessing her height, her build, her approximate age. He called out a number to a scribe standing nearby. The scribe dipped a brush into ink and made a mark in a ledger. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. Zarya did not scream. She did not run. She had watched what happened to the women who screamed and ran. She had learned in the past 3 days that silence was not surrender. Silence was survival. She was loaded onto a cart with 17 other women. The cart began to move. The city she had lived in her entire life disappeared behind her, swallowed by dust and smoke. Her name was no longer Zarya. It was now a number inked onto her wrist in the angular script of the Mongol administrative system. She was a unit in a ledger, a resource in a system, a piece of a plan so vast, so coldly rational, so historically unprecedented that the world would not fully understand what had happened until 8 centuries later, when scientists looked into the DNA of 16 million living human beings and found the same unmistakable signature buried in every single one of them. This is not simply a story about conquest. It is not simply a story about violence, though violence runs through every page of it like a river that never stops. This is a story about something more disturbing than brutality. It is a story about a man who looked at the human body itself and saw a weapon, who looked at reproduction and saw a tool of empire, who understood centuries before anyone else dared to think it, that the most permanent conquest was not the conquest of land or cities or armies, but the conquest of the future itself. This is the story of how that understanding was born, how it became a system, and why its echoes are still alive in the world today. To understand what Genghis Khan built, you have to understand where he came from. And where he came from was a place that most conquerors in history never had to survive. He was born in 1162 on the steppes of Mongolia with the name Temujin. The steppes in that era were not the romanticized landscape of nomadic freedom that later historians sometimes painted. They were a brutal, unforgiving world where power was the only currency and weakness was a death sentence. Tribes raided each other constantly. Alliances formed and dissolved overnight. A man's worth was measured entirely by what he could take and what he could hold. Temujin was born into a family that had very little of either. His father, Yasuge, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, not powerful, not wealthy, but proud and proud enough to make enemies. When Temujin was 9 years old, Yasuge was poisoned by members of the Tatar tribe men who had been his guests at a feast. He died on the ride home. By the time he reached his own camp, he was already beyond saving. What happened next shaped Temujin more than anything else in his life. The clan abandoned the family. A chieftain's widow and her children were a burden, not an asset. One morning, the entire camp simply packed up and moved on without them, leaving Hoylun and her children alone on the steppe with almost nothing. Temujin's mother was not a woman who collapsed under pressure. She was, in every sense that mattered, the first great teacher of his life. Hoylun fed her children on roots dug from frozen ground and fish pulled from rivers with bare hands. She kept them alive through winters that killed stronger people. She maintained her dignity and her authority in a situation designed to strip both away. But there was something else about Hoylun that Temujin carried with him long after childhood. Something that shaped his understanding of the world in ways no one could have predicted. Hoylun herself had been taken. Years before Temujin was born, Hoylun had been the wife of another man, a Merkite warrior named Chiladu. Yasuge, Temujin's father, had seen her traveling with her new husband and had simply taken her. Chiladu rode away to save his own life. Hoylun became Yasuge's wife. She had no say in the matter. That was how the world worked on the steppe. Temujin grew up knowing this story. He grew up knowing that his own existence was the product of a woman being taken from one man and given to another. He grew up watching his mother, strong, brilliant, unbowed, living out the consequences of that transaction every day. And somewhere in the mind of that hungry, angry, brilliant child, an understanding began to form. Women were not merely prizes, they were foundations. Control a woman and you controlled her children. Control her children and you controlled the next generation. Control the next generation and you controlled the future. He was 9 years old when this idea began to take root. He would spend the next 50 years turning it into an empire. The next lesson came when Temujin was 16, and it was the most personal lesson of all. His betrothed was a girl named Borte from the Conquest tribe. The betrothal had been arranged when they were both children, and Temujin had every reason to look forward to it. Borte was said to be intelligent and graceful. The alliance would strengthen his position. It was by every measure a good match. But before the marriage could be completed, Borte was kidnapped. A raiding party from the Merkite tribe, the same tribe whose warrior Yasuge had taken Hoilun from, swept through the camp and seized Borte as a form of revenge. It was a calculated insult, a way of settling an old score. They were not interested in Borte herself. They were interested in what taking her meant. Temujin spent the better part of a year hunting for her. He formed alliances called in favors, built the early coalition of warriors that would eventually become the foundation of his empire, all for the purpose of getting her back. When he finally found her, she was alive. She was also pregnant. Temujin took her back. He raised the child, a son named Jochi, as his own. He never publicly questioned Jochi's parentage. But the whispers followed Jochi his entire life, through every campaign, every promotion, every moment of achievement. They were there in the way certain generals spoke about him, in the way certain courtiers lowered their eyes when his name was mentioned. The question of whether Jochi was truly Temujin's son was never resolved, and everyone in the empire knew it. For Temujin, the experience of losing Borte and getting her back changed something fundamental in his thinking. Not because it destroyed his love for her. There is good evidence that he loved Borte deeply for the rest of his life. But because it forced him to confront a question that no other conqueror in history had ever really sat with. What does it mean when you cannot know if your own child is yours? Other men in his position might have found this question unbearable and turned away from it. Temujin, with the cold, systematic mind that would eventually forge the largest land empire in human history, looked directly at it. He pulled it apart. He examined every side of it, and he arrived at a conclusion that was both brilliant and monstrous. The uncertainty that tormented him personally was not merely a wound. It was a key. If the identity of fathers could be made uncertain on a mass scale, if women taken in conquest bore children whose lineage was permanently and irreversibly connected to the conqueror, then conquest itself became something that could never be fully undone. Territory could be recaptured. Armies could be rebuilt. Cities could be retaken. But children already born could not be unborn. Blood already mixed could not be unmixed. A generation already shaped by conquest could not be unshapen. He began to build toward this understanding quietly through years of observation. He noticed something that other chieftains either did not see or did not think to act upon. After battles, the men of defeated tribes mourned their dead rebuilt. Their strength waited for their moment to strike back. Warriors who had been captured often took their own lives rather than submit. The resistance of men was fierce, costly, and in many cases fatal to the conquerors who had to manage it. But the women adapted. Not because women were weaker. Temujin had a mother who had kept 5 children alive on a frozen steppe, and he had no illusions about the weakness of women. They adapted because survival was a different kind of intelligence, because children needed to be fed and raised regardless of who had won the last battle, because the biological reality of pregnancy and motherhood created a timeline that moved independently of political outcomes. And the children those women bore, children raised in new circumstances, shaped by new powers, absorbing new loyalties from birth. Those children did not mourn the old world their mothers had been taken from. They grew up in the new one. By 1206, when the assembled tribes of the Mongolian steppe declared Temujin, the great Khan, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the theory had become doctrine. The system was ready to be tested. But in that same year, Genghis Khan issued an order that no general in the history of warfare had ever given before. He commanded that his armies would march with doctors, not surgeons to treat wounded soldiers, not healers to manage plague in the camps. Physicians trained in a specific and unprecedented discipline, the monitoring and management of female reproductive capacity. The commanders who received this order understood immediately what it meant. This was not a campaign, this was a program. The first real test came in 1209 against the Tangut Kingdom in what is now northwestern China. The Tangut were not a weak enemy. They had a sophisticated civilization, fortified cities, and a military capable of serious resistance. What they had never encountered and had no framework for understanding was the administrative apparatus that arrived alongside the Mongol army. Because the army that marched against the Tangut in 1209 was unlike any military force the world had seen before. Mixed among the cavalry and the siege engineers were scribes with ink and ledgers, physicians trained not in battlefield surgery, but in something altogether different, and administrators carrying blank forms designed to record specific categories of information. In the weeks before the Mongol army reached each Tangut city advance, scouts moved through the surrounding territory conducting what amounted to a census, not a military census, a human one. How many women lived in this city? What were their ages? What were their family connections? What were their physical characteristics? This information was written on scrolls that traveled ahead of the army like a shadow. By the time the walls fell, the Mongols already knew precisely what they would find inside. When the cities fell, and they fell one after another, with the grinding inevitability of the Mongol war machine, the process began immediately. The men were killed or enslaved according to their utility. The women were divided. The division was not random, and it was not cruel in the way that mindless violence is cruel. It was methodical, systematic. It was the application of a bureaucratic logic to human beings, and in many ways that was worse than chaos would have been. Chaos at least implies the absence of intent. What the Mongols built in those first campaigns against the Tangut was intent in its purest and most terrible form. Women between the ages of 14 and 30, those deemed to be in their primary reproductive years and in good physical health, were separated into the first category. Women between 30 and 40, particularly those who had already demonstrated the ability to bear healthy children, formed the second. Those outside these ranges, the very young, the old, the sick, were placed in a third category that had no positive future attached to it. The first two categories were marked. Ink on the wrist, a number, a classification, a code that told the administrative system everything it needed to know at a glance. Then they were loaded into the carts. These were not ordinary supply wagons. They had been designed and built specifically for this purpose, which is itself a disturbing measure of how thoroughly Genghis Khan had thought through the system before the first campaign began. The carts were divided into compartments. Women who had just been captured were separated from those already pregnant. Pregnant women in early stages were separated from those approaching birth. There were carts for women who had recently given birth. There were carts for women classified as unproductive, awaiting a fate that the administrators recorded with the same neutral terminology they used for everything else in their ledgers. The Mongol physicians who traveled with these caravans were practicing a form of medicine that would have been unrecognizable to any healer in the Western world. They experimented with herbal compounds that appeared to affect the timing of ovulation. They developed nutritional protocols designed to sustain pregnancy in women being marched across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. They monitored signs of pregnancy with obsessive attention to detail. All of it was recorded. Every examination, every determination, every outcome. The women in the system were not people in the eyes of those records. They were data points in a project of staggering ambition. And here is the detail that separates this from every other atrocity in the ancient world. While European physicians in 1209 were still debating theories inherited from the Greeks, while Islamic scholars were the most advanced medical minds in the Western world, and even they had never conceived of applying medicine to this purpose, the Mongol system was already running controlled protocols on human reproduction at industrial scale. This was not barbarism. This was science deployed in the service of the darkest possible objective. The women themselves lost their names the day they were captured. Their names were replaced by numbers that encoded their tribal origin, their reproductive classification, and their administrative history. Some of them whispered their real names into the ears of their infants in the dark. Some of them scratched marks into their own skin in places the administrators would not see, small, private monuments to the people they had been before the carts. The system was learning as it went. By the time the campaigns against the Jin Empire of northern China began in 1211, the Mongols had refined their methods to a degree that made the Tangut campaigns look like rough drafts. In 1213, records document caravans of more than 100,000 women moving through the vast territories east of Mongolia. These were not disorganized masses of captives. They were organized, subdivided, administered, and moving according to a logistics system that would not have been out of place in a modern military supply chain. Supply stations serviced the caravans at intervals. Field hospitals managed births that occurred in transit. Sorting centers processed the children born along the route, making the classifications that determined whether an infant would be raised as a Mongol all or removed from the record entirely. The sheer scale of what had been constructed defies easy comprehension. Think about what it means to move 100,000 human beings across difficult terrain over hundreds of miles, feeding them enough to keep them alive and functional, monitoring their health, recording their status, maintaining the administrative continuity of a system complex enough to track individual women from point of capture to final disposition. This was not the work of raiders. This was the work of an empire that had decided at the highest level of policy that the systematic control of human reproduction was a strategic priority equal to any military objective. When Genghis Khan turned his full attention to the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, the machine was perfected. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched from the eastern shores of the Caspian Sea deep into Central Asia. It included cities that were among the most magnificent on earth. Samarkand, with its towering mosques and its markets that drew traders from 3 continents. Bukhara, ancient and proud, a center of scholarship and culture that had been accumulating wealth and knowledge for centuries. None of that mattered to the process that was coming. 6 weeks before the Mongol army reached each major city, the advanced intelligence networks had already completed their work. Not military intelligence alone. Family intelligence. Social intelligence. The names of women, their ages, their children, their emotional attachments and social positions. All of it mapped and recorded before a single arrow was fired. The Mongols had also learned something psychologically precise and devastating through years of systematic observation. A woman kept with her young children for the first 3 months of captivity was significantly more cooperative than a woman separated immediately. She ate more. She maintained her health better. She caused fewer administrative problems. The system accommodated this. It was patient. It could wait 3 months. After 3 months, the children were taken away. The psychological impact of that separation was the Mongols had determined permanent. A woman who had adapted her behavior entirely around protecting her children and then had those children removed was broken in a way that no amount of physical force could match. The resistance that followed was not the resistance of someone biding their time. It was the hollowed-out compliance of someone whose reason to resist had been methodically, deliberately, surgically removed. This was the level of sophistication embedded in the system by 1219. This was not cruelty born of ignorance. It was cruelty born of very careful attention to human psychology. The difference between those two things is the difference between a crime and an institution. The cities fell. Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur. One after another with names that had rung through the world for centuries, they were reduced to operational problems to be processed by the Mongol administrative machine. Noble women were handled differently from women of lower social status, but not for reasons of compassion. The calculation was genetic. Women of aristocratic lineage tended to produce children whose physical characteristics were more easily absorbed into the Mongol elite. They were assigned to higher-ranking officers and given marginally better conditions. Their children, if they displayed suitable traits, had better prospects within the system. Women of peasant background were processed in larger groups. Their value lay in endurance, the demonstrated ability to survive pregnancy under brutal conditions and produce children resilient enough to thrive in the empire's expanding territories. The system extracted everything it could from every category of person it processed. Nothing was wasted. That was the point. By 1220, the caravans stretched for distances that eyewitnesses could not fully describe. One account speaks of a line of carts and people that took 3 days to pass a single point on a road. The horror of all of this was not only in its violence. The violence was real and enormous. But the deeper horror, the thing that sets this apart from the ordinary brutalities of conquest, was its orderliness. Every act was documented, every woman was numbered, every child was weighed against administrative criteria. Evil had been transformed into a filing system, and that transformation is what made it possible to conduct evil at a scale that personal brutality could never have achieved. But there is another side to this story. There always is. The women inside the system were not simply victims. They were people with intelligence and memory and an instinct for survival that the administrative machine, for all its sophistication, could not fully account for. Because you cannot catalog memory. You cannot classify a lullaby. You cannot sort a language into productive and unproductive categories. The resistance that emerged inside the caravans had no weapons and no generals and never appeared in any official record. It was too small for that, too human, too invisible to the scribes who were focused on numbers and classifications and the orderly processing of reproductive resources. It was the resistance of women who whispered their real names into their children's ears in the dark, who taught their daughters and sons the words of prayers in languages that had been forbidden, who developed systems of gesture and signal through which information moved invisibly through the caravan, warnings about which guards could be reasoned with, knowledge about which herbs could affect the course of a pregnancy. Simple human intelligence passed from hand to hand in a world that had decided hands were only useful for labor. Some women found ways to damage their own health strategically in ways that made them less valuable to the system without killing them outright. The Mongol physicians noticed some of these methods and countered them with increased monitoring. The women adapted and found new methods. This silent war appears in no chronicle of the Mongol conquests, but it was a war conducted in whispers and gestures and small defiances that cost everything and were recorded nowhere. The most powerful resistance was also the simplest and the hardest to sustain. It was the determination to remember who you were. In the logic of the system, a woman who forgot her name, her language, her family, her history, who became in her own mind nothing more than the number on her wrist, was the ideal product. Compliance required the erasure of self. The women who kept themselves alive inside their own minds, who maintained the interior landscape of identity against the systematic pressure to erase it, were committing an act of defiance that no administrator could see or quantify or stop. They sang, softly at night in languages the guards did not understand. They created rituals so small they were invisible to anyone not taught to read them. The way a hand touched a shoulder in a specific moment. The way a phrase carried a second meaning beneath its surface. The way a woman traced a pattern on the ground with one finger while appearing to do something else entirely. These things kept people alive. Not physically. The system controlled the physical world with brutal efficiency, but alive in a way the system could not touch alive in the place where a person knows who they are and where they came from and what they loved before everything was taken. And that aliveness mattered enormously, because those whispered names and those night songs were seeds and some of them grew. Genghis Khan died in 1227 in the middle of a renewed campaign against the Tangut, the same people his conquest had begun with nearly 2 decades earlier. The cause of his death has been debated for centuries. A fall from a horse, an illness that came on suddenly, an arrow wound that never properly healed. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old, ancient for a man who had spent his entire adult life at war. His death did not end the system. It had been built to outlast its architect, and it did. The funeral was a ceremony that encapsulated everything about the empire he had built. 40 young women were buried alive alongside his body, an offering to accompany him into whatever world came after this one. The road to his burial place was cleared by killing everyone who witnessed the procession so that the location could never be found. Even in death, the machinery of control continued to run, but those visible ceremonies were almost a sideshow. The real transition of power required something far larger. Throughout the vast network of caravans, women who had been classified as too aware of the system's geography, too connected to each other, too potentially destabilizing, during the political uncertainty that follows any ruler's death, these women were killed. Not in a rage, not in a panic, by administrative decision. Their bodies were disposed of in organized pits, arranged with the same attention to order and documentation that had defined every aspect of their captivity. Archaeologists in Central Asia began finding these pits centuries later. What they found in them was in its own way as devastating as any written account. The skeletons were predominantly young women separated from the male burials that surrounded them as they had been separated in life. Their bones told stories their voices never could. Signs of chronic malnutrition consistent with prolonged deprivation. Fractures in legs and feet consistent with forced marches across hundreds of miles. Evidence of repeated physical trauma distributed across bodies in patterns that spoke clearly to anyone trained to read them. Beside many of these women were the remains of infants and very young children buried without the grave goods or ritual care that Mongol culture normally extended to its dead. These children had not been part of the empire. They had been products of it. The distinction apparently was maintained even in death. In 2003, near the ruins of ancient Bukhara, a team of archaeologists working a site flagged by a chance discovery during construction uncovered something that would become one of the most cited pieces of physical evidence for what the Mongol system had actually been. They found two skeletons, a woman and a teenage girl lying side by side in a pit dug in a hurry, without ceremony, without the markers of intentional burial. DNA analysis was conducted. The results confirmed what the positioning had suggested. They were mother and daughter. Further analysis told a more complex story. The mother had spent her entire life within a small geographic radius of where she was buried. Her bones showed the mineral signatures of the local water and soil absorbed over a lifetime. She had been born near Bukhara and had never traveled far from it. Her daughter had traveled extensively. The isotopic signatures in her bones told a story of movement across enormous distances. She had been taken from the city where her mother lived, processed through the caravan system that crossed Central Asia and carried thousands of miles from her origin. And then by the random arithmetic of death and geography, she had ended up buried next to her mother. They had not been permitted to be together in life. The earth had returned them to each other when it was over. The researchers who published the findings described what they felt when the DNA results came back. They used the word haunting, not as a literary flourish, as an honest description of the experience of holding evidence of something so specific and so human in the context of a system so vast and so inhuman. Two women, one who never left home, one who was carried to the far edges of the empire and back, reunited by accident, by centuries, by the patient work of science in the soil of a city that had watched them both disappear. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan inherited the system along with everything else. Ogedei Khan carried it into Europe, into Poland and Hungary, where genetic studies still detect the signature of those campaigns 8 centuries later. Möngke Khan applied it in the heart of the Islamic world, following the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. Kublai Khan, who established the Yuan dynasty in China, and whom many Westerners know through the accounts of Marco Polo, integrated it into the social fabric of the largest empire the world had ever seen. What had begun as one man's vision became dynastic tradition. The largest contiguous land empire in human history ran in part on a system that had converted human reproduction into a mechanism of permanent conquest. The empire eventually fragmented, as all empires do. The caravans eventually stopped. The ledgers eventually rotted. But what had been done in those decades could not be undone. The modern science of genetics has provided a confirmation that is in its own way as disturbing as any archaeological discovery. Analysis of the Y chromosome. The genetic material that passes directly from father to son across generations without significant modification reveals a pattern first documented in a landmark study published in 2003. Roughly 16 million men alive today carry a Y chromosome that traces directly back to Genghis Khan and his immediate male relatives. 16 million people, 1 in every 200 men on Earth. In Mongolia, the concentration reaches nearly 8% of the male population. In Central Asia, it hovers around 3%. In Eastern Europe, far from the heartland of the Mongol campaigns, the genetic signature still appears in measurable numbers. This is not legend. This is not exaggeration. This is a number derived from the physical analysis of human DNA by scientists who approach the question with the same rigor applied to any other biological problem. 1 in 200 men alive today carries within him the genetic consequence of a system built by one man on the steppes of Mongolia in the 12th century. A system built on the premise that reproduction could be conquered, controlled, and turned into an instrument of permanent empire. But here is what the genetic studies cannot measure. The women taken into that system also left descendants. They survived, many of them, and their children grew up carrying two inheritances at once. The genetic inheritance of the conqueror, yes, but also something transmitted not through chromosomes, but through the channels of culture and memory that the administrative machine could monitor but never fully close. The night songs, the whispered names, the way a mother taught her child a word in a language that was supposed to be forbidden, the way a prayer was encoded inside an apparently meaningless daily ritual. These things pass from the women of the caravan system into the cultures of Persia, of China, of Central Asia, of Eastern Europe. They are there still, not always identifiable, not always traceable to their origin, but present in ways that historians and anthropologists have only recently begun to examine seriously. The conqueror left his mark in the DNA of millions. The conquered left their mark in the memory of cultures that refuse to forget. Both marks are real. Both marks are permanent. The question of which one matters more is not a scientific question. It is a human one. Come back now to Zarya. She was 14 years old in the spring of 1220. Her name was recorded in a Mongol ledger as a number. Her braid, her laugh, the name she had given, her imagined future children, none of that was recorded anywhere. The ledger only wanted to know what she was worth to the system. We do not know what happened to her. The historical record does not follow individual women through the caravan system. It follows numbers, and numbers do not tell individual stories. She may have died in the first year, as many did. She may have survived, adapted, found ways to preserve something of herself in the margins of a system designed to leave no margins. She may have had children. If she did, those children may have had children of their own, and those children may have had children still. If they did, then somewhere in the world today, in a city in Central Asia or further west, in a country once touched by the edge of the Mongol expansion, there are people who carry within them both the bloodline of the empire and the memory of a girl who stood still in the ruins of her city and kept her own name alive in her mind when everything else was taken. The Mongol Empire fell. The system it built wound down. But the consequences of what was done in those caravans, across those miles, in those decades of systematic conquest, those consequences did not fall with the empire. They are in the bones of women unearthed in Central Asia. They are in the genetic code of 16 million living human beings. They are in the folk songs of cultures from Iran to China that carry in their melodies traces of a world that was shattered and then slowly and imperfectly rebuilt. History is often described as the story of the victors, and in one sense, the history of the Mongol conquest is exactly that, an almost incomprehensible story of military and political success of a single people from the edge of the known world building an empire that dwarfed everything before it. But beneath that story, running parallel to it, invisible in the official chronicles, but legible in the bones and the genes and the folk memory of half a continent, is another history. The history of the people who were processed by the machine, who were numbered and classified and moved across the map like resources, who were denied their names and their languages and their futures and their choices, and who refused in the only ways left available to them to be fully erased. Genghis Khan conquered nations. He conquered cities. He conquered bloodlines in a way that is still measurable 8 centuries after his death. He built a system whose efficiency would not be matched until the industrialized machinery of 20th century totalitarianism. But there is one thing his system could not conquer: the permanence of being remembered by the people who loved you, the permanence of a name whispered in the dark, passed from a mother to a child, passed from that child to another, carried forward across generations in the invisible inheritance of memory and the human need to know where you came from. Zarya's name is not in any chronicle. The number that replaced it has been dust for 8 centuries. But saying her name now, meaning it, insisting that she was a person and not a resource, is a small continuation of the resistance that began in those carts in 1220. Genghis Khan conquered nations. He conquered cities. He conquered bloodlines in a way that science can still measure today. He did not conquer memory, and in the end, memory is the only history that matters.